Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining the New America Fellows Program for a discussion of Brian Goldstone's magnificent book, "There Is No Place for Us: Working and Homeless in America." Um, I'm Reuben Jonathan Miller. I'm a 2019 New America Fellow. I'm also a sociologist and a social worker. I teach at the University of Chicago. Before we start, there are two housekeeping notes. One, if you have questions during the event, please submit them through the Q&A function, and we'll get to them in the second half of the event. And two, copies of There Is No Place for Us are available through our book selling partner, Solid State Books. You can find a link to buy the book on this page. Please click buy the book. So to say just a little bit about Brian, he's a 2021 New America Fellow, a journalist, and also a journalist whose long form reporting and essays have appeared in Harper's Magazine, The New Republic, the California Sunday Magazine, and Jacobin, among other publications. He has a PhD in anthropology from Duke University and was a Mellon Research Fellow at Columbia University. He lives in Atlanta with his family. And so we're so pleased, Brian, I'm so pleased to be in conversation with you about this magnificent book. And so I just want to give you a few, like maybe just a couple minutes to say what you were trying to accomplish in the book. If just what were you up to? What were you trying to do? What brought you to study working homeless people in this precarious in the precarious position that you document so well. So maybe we'll start there.
Yeah, sure. Well, Ruben, it is such a privilege and honor to be in conversation with you as a reader of yours, someone who has been inspired by your scholarship and just your beautiful narrative prose. Like it truly is just a gift to be doing this with you. So thank you. Yeah, let me just tell you a little bit about the book, maybe, and then I can say a few words about how I came to the subject. So the book follows 5 families in Atlanta over a period of about 2 years, and it follows 5 families who are working jobs. They're driving for Uber and Lyft. They are cleaning the Atlanta airport, mopping floors. They are caregivers, taking care of elders. And despite their jobs, in many cases more than one job, it's not enough. Their paychecks simply are not enough to secure stable housing for themselves and their kids. And so they're part of this widespread but largely invisible crisis, like the dramatic rise of the working homeless in cities across America. And by following the family's journeys over the course of about 2 years in the book itself, we see how like this toxic combination of skyrocketing rents, low wages, really poverty wages, and a lack of like just basic tenant protections, along with forces like racialized displacement, gentrification, the revitalization of urban space, how all of these forces together are just pushing more and more families into homelessness. And maybe we can come back to why it's important to frame it in terms of being pushed into homelessness and not just like sometimes the way we speak about this is like, oh, people are falling into poverty, people are falling into homelessness. And I'm trying to show in the book, and I think the reporting does show, that there's all of these interlocking systems and structural conditions that are actively militating against the stability of even people who are like working and working and working some more, and it's still not enough to secure this most basic human necessity. And it was really that reality, that this term working homeless could even exist in America that first led me to want to write this book. It started as a magazine story for the New Republic, and and where I just followed one family in Atlanta. And, this was a mom who was named Kokithia Goodman, who was working full-time as a home health aide in Atlanta. And she and her children were stably housed. What they thought they were stably housed in a rental home in a neighborhood called Peoplestown, a historically Black working class neighborhood. And as that neighborhood was being transformed and was considered now hot by real estate investors, her landlord, who had bought this home as an investment property, an investment vehicle, decided to sell and terminated the family's lease. And by the time I met them, they had been homeless for about 3 months. And as I followed them in their journey, I began to wonder, like, how pervasive is this? Is this family just like a bizarre anomaly? How many people in this country are unhoused and are also part of the formal labor force? And as I continued to report, not only in that story, but ultimately in what became this book, I saw that not only is it pervasive, but people like that family, people like Ms. Goodman, actually constitute the overwhelming majority of people experiencing homelessness in America. They have just been written out of the story we tell ourselves as a country about homelessness. And so the numbers are actually way, way bigger than the official count that we are given of how many people are homeless in the United States. The official count, as bad as it is, and it's at the highest level on record, if we count all the families who I follow in this book and really an estimated, let's see, almost 3.5 million families and individuals like them who are left out of the official count, we see that this crisis, as bad as it is actually much worse. But it's just been hidden. It's been rendered invisible. So that striking reality and all of the different forces that I mentioned a moment ago that have come together to produce this crisis is what led me to want to write a book, because I realized I had only scratched the surface in that earlier reporting.
Yeah, the pushed into homelessness, um, rendered homeless,
Mm,
um, to be made into a thing, to be to be molded into the predicaments that we find people happen for a bunch of reasons in the book. I mean, there's kind of an expert policy analysis that happens in many chapters of the book, from transformation of housing policy, but also a change of the business environment, which makes me think about Atlanta as being a really important place to do this,
mhm,
as a city that's at once an exemplar of other places, but it's a forerunner for so many other things. So I wanted you to maybe spend some time talking to us about Atlanta, the role of
mhm.
Atlanta, the changing nature of Atlanta, over these years that perhaps helps push people in these ways.
Sure, yeah. So, one way of answering that question, like why Atlanta, is to talk a little bit about the title of the book, There Is No Place for Us, because that title actually comes from one of the main families in the book, who she's a fifth generation Atlantan. Her roots in the family, her roots in the city go back 5 generations. And Brett, she loves the new Atlanta. She loves like what Atlanta's becoming. She loves how sexy it is now. She loves all the new breweries and boutique hotel. Like it's just, she likes how shiny it's become. She has no nostalgia like a lot of her older relatives do for like the old Atlanta and, the grittier Atlanta. She loves it, and she wants this city to be hers. She feels like this city is as much hers as anyone's, and she doesn't want to go anywhere. She wants to make a home for her and her children, her two children in this city. And, you know, one of the big kind of arguments that the reporting is trying to sort of the reporting is trying to show and substantiate is that the insecurity that Britt and her children and so many like them experience is a direct byproduct of Atlanta's success.
Yeah.
In many ways, when Britt and her children end up becoming homeless, and for all of these really preventable reasons, like for utterly unnecessary reasons. I mean, above all, just the growing chasm between the wages she earns, even as like a shift lead at Chick-fil-A ultimately, is not even close enough to what she needs to afford like a basic apartment. But when Britt and her children become homeless, they in many ways are the casualties of Atlanta's success. And I think that is kind of shocking to say out loud, because we're used to thinking of homelessness, as a kind of extreme form of poverty that tends to spring up in like what we imagine to be the hollowed out, urban core, the poorest areas of the city. We I think of homelessness intuitively as kind of a crisis of poverty. And I'm trying to show through this reporting that no, like this mounting homelessness crisis and this crisis of housing precarity is actually in many ways a crisis of prosperity. It's the product not of a failing economy, because Atlanta, like so many cities across the country, far from seeing a failing economy in the city, the economy is thriving, just not for people like Britt and her children. And and it's important to note that Britt, and all the families I'm following in this book, they are not like on the fringes of society. They are the very people powering the economy. They are the very people making this sexy new Atlanta. And we could substitute Nashville there. We could substitute Charlotte. We could substitute Austin. We could substitute any number of cities. The people powering these cities through their labor are being systematically pushed out, not just of their neighborhoods that they grew up in, like Britt was, but increasingly because of that toxic mix of soaring rents, low wages, and a lack of tenant rights. They are being pushed out of housing altogether. And so the question of why Atlanta uh, is because of how representative it is. Yes, there's a lot that's unique about it. And when Brett says toward the end of the book, there's no place for us here anymore, it's it's a gutting thing to hear, because of how committed she was to making the city her home. And she realizes that there's no place for her anymore. And there is no place for us, that's not just being said in Atlanta. That's an Atlanta title, yes, but it's also a Chicago title. It's also a Nashville title. It's also an LA title. It's a sentiment that people across the country who are poor and working class, and even those who belong to the downwardly mobile middle class as well, I think are saying with greater frequency.
There's a kind of administrative violence that comes with well that catalyzes a bunch of many of these experiences. And just to stick with Atlanta for a hot second, some of the things you point out that I found interesting, striking, and important is Atlanta's role, for example, in the advent of public housing across the country, being
Yeah.
like this incubator of public housing. So this progressive move, and then in this haunting line, you say that it's something to the extent I don't have it up in front of me, but it's like the city that you basically gives birth to public housing becomes the first to end it.
Exactly.
And this retreat from public housing stock, for example, and this embrace of private public relationships to allow for housing for or as the response to the needs, that the housing needs of an entire group of people who are precariously attached to the job market.
Yes.
Like the way you do this and the way you weave that, I think, fairly complicated analysis with the real lives and experiences of these families as they move through the places, just brilliant, incredible.
If I could just jump in there really quick,
Please.
because Britt, who I was just talking about, I mean, through her own family story, you can sort of tell the story about housing in America, housing
Yeah.
policy in America, and the vicissitudes of housing policy in America. Because Britt, she grew up in public housing when she was little. Like she was first, she lived in East Lake Meadows, which if anyone has seen it, there's a great documentary on East Lake Meadows called East Lake Meadows, a public housing story. It was called Little Vietnam. It's one of the most kind of notorious housing projects in the country. Britt's family doesn't remember it as Little Vietnam. They remember it as a place where people managed to forge a semblance of community despite overwhelming odds, despite just abysmal conditions, many of which those conditions arose from just a systematic disinvestment in that complex in public housing from its inception, the inception of that particular development. But so Britt grew up in public housing. Her family was displaced when East Lake Meadows was torn down to make way for this a golf course where the PGA Championship is now held in Atlanta, right next door to where East Lake Meadows was. Her family was displaced. They moved to another public housing development, Bowen Homes. And when that was torn down, Britt and her mother and some of and her siblings became homeless. They were living in hotels and doubled up with relatives. So, but Britt, you know, she ultimately like her North Star, like her the thing that she is just counting on to be able to make a home in the city is a housing voucher. When in 2017, no, I'm sorry, 2015, Atlanta announces for the first time in years that they're going to be opening up the voucher lottery. Britt, like everyone she knows, enters the lottery because this housing voucher system has taken the place of public housing, right? Like the government decided in the 80s when one of Reagan's HUD deputies said, "We're getting out of the housing business, period." What that signaled was that the federal government was no longer going to be the provider of housing for people who needed it most. We were now going to be turning to the private market, subsidizing the private market to take care of the housing needs of people who need it in this country. And so this voucher lottery that Britt enters is supposed to be that thing that, okay, this is how I can secure a future. And Britt, miraculously, she wins the lottery. She thinks
Fairly quickly.
she went, yes. And, and she has to wait 2 years on the waiting list before she's actually receiving the voucher. But, I mean, just to like the fact that Atlanta was the first city in the country to build public housing, and then in the 90s and 2000s, the first city to tear it down. And when they were tearing it down, it was because we're now putting all of our faith in this voucher system, and forget the fact that only 1 in 4 Americans or American households, low income households who check all the boxes to qualify for housing assistance through a voucher, actually receive it, right? It's not an entitlement like Medicaid or food stamps, where if you meet the requirements, you automatically get it. 1 in 4 people, 1 in 4 households actually receive it. And Brett was lucky enough to be one of those 1 in 4. And then she gets the voucher and it expires before she can find a landlord to rent to her ultimately. And she loses the voucher. And so it's like the story of the government stepping up and saying, we're going to make sure people in this country have a place to live. During the Depression, when public housing merged, that gave way to this market ideology that said, like, the government's getting out of the way, and somehow the private market was supposed to fill that gap, and it simply hasn't. So Britt, in her own family's experience, in her own experience with the system, she saw the fruit of that kind of faith in that transition from public to private.
No, it was such a heartbreaking uh, story. One of the notes that I took was about the importance of time,
Mm,
how time is working for people. This hustle, this race to
Mhm.
the race to find an apartment. Can you talk about the details of this? This shows up later. So to tell you where I'm going. On the one hand,
Mhm.
there's this voucher. There's the voucher time problem. On the other hand, there's past the inspection time problem that happens later. The environmental inspection that I forget who had to uh,
Yeah.
yeah. So if you could talk about some of this administrative violence, like what this, like how it's working, and the role of time, and kind of the pace that people have to get on their feet that's being required.
I mean, it's a wonderful question because, you know, when we talk about housing insecurity or homelessness in this kind of abstract way, we can lose touch with the visceral anxiety, the
Yeah.
visceral bodily stress of trying to secure a place to live, especially when you have kids in the mix. And this kind of time crunch, this time pressure is is omnipresent. I felt it in the reporting, in the in the field work. I felt it constantly. And and yeah, I mean, in the examples you just mentioned, the race to try, okay, the time is running down. I have 30 days, now I have 10 days, now I have 1 day to find a landlord who is willing to take this voucher that could be my ticket out of this pit of suffering that me and my children have been inhabiting. I have 30 days, now I have 15 days, now I have 1 day for the city of Atlanta to basically just fill out a form for this environmental review because this is another family, Kara and her children, who again, like kind of won the lottery. They got the housing assistance. And then because of this bureaucratic, like, I mean, bureaucratic nightmare is a cliche. There's something more here that is just brutal. And
Mhm.
and this environmental review, someone in some office somewhere just had to fill out a form. It wasn't done. And her apartment that she was supposed to get is given away to someone else, and she loses this assistant. It's like, and to watch that up close, to watch the search for housing, the search for housing can become a kind of euphemism that again obscures just the radical stress, the radical sleeplessness, anxiety. And that's another thing, sleep, just the parents, the children not sleeping night after night, partly because of the conditions they're in, because there's a leaky ceiling in this squalid extended stay hotel room. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the world of extended stay hotels because that's a big kind of site in the book. There's a lot going on at these hotels as kind of the site par excellence of like the new American homelessness in a way. Um, Whether it's because of the conditions they're in, they're not sleeping because of gunshots outside of their hotel room door, or because as a parent, you're terrified sleeping in your car in a Walmart parking lot that the cops are going to knock on your window and then call Child Protective Services and your kids are going to get taken away because of inadequate housing. And in a state like Georgia, 1/3 of child removals are happening every year because of inadequate housing. Whether it's those kinds of external forces that are keeping you awake, or whether it's just the fear, the terror that I'm not going to be able to find this in time, I'm not going to be able to cobble together the money to pay for this room, and we might be out in the parking lot as one of the families ends up in getting put out of their hotel room, and mom and her daughter, they end up sleeping in the parking lot of a hotel. So that creates just an unbelievable amount of stress. And to see, and it creates, again, like we use these euphemisms, mental health issues, that those mental health issues are not the cause of what push people into homelessness. It's a consequence of
Yeah.
experiencing that kind of precarity day in, day out. And it transforms people's brain chemistry. And for children, what public health researchers call toxic stress, and the ways that chokes futures, the ways that it leads to developmental delay, it leads to educational issue. I mean, just you name it. And so yes, your question about time is so crucial, and I really appreciate that.
Speaking of time, I would like to remind the audience that that it'd be lovely to get your questions, and so please, if you have questions, post them in the I think it's in the chat, or there's a chat or a question function on Zoom. Okay, so the extended stay hotel is exactly where I wanted to go. I wanted to first ask you though to talk about a couple, because I feel like Maurice and Natalia are an exemplar of people who do just about everything right.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love for you to talk a little bit about them and their route into precarity. And then I'd absolutely want to talk about, the extended stay hotel. I feel like this
Yeah, yeah.
giant.
Well, yeah, I mean, their story is the perfect segue into that subject because Maurice and Natalia, they both grew up in DC, born and raised. Their grandparents and great grandparents fled the Jim Crow South to the North, seeking economic opportunity that was not there for Black families in the South. So they end up in DC. Their grandparents, great grandparents, end up in DC. Maurice and Natalia are both raised there. Again, just like Britt in Atlanta, they feel very emotionally, psychologically attached to DC. This is their city, but as their neighborhood was gentrifying in DC, they were priced out and then pushed out. And so they end up moving to Atlanta. And Maurice and Natalia, like this is a two-parent household. So like whatever stereotypes and myths we have that this kind of homelessness is like just a phenomenon unique to single mothers. And I mean, this is a two-parent household, two incomes, and even that is not enough to keep them and their children out of homelessness. And so, without going into all the particular, I mean, their journey is really one of not this big dramatic event happening, but basically like the catalyst for them ultimately becoming homeless is they've been renting a two-bedroom condo for years in Atlanta, and then their landlord
Paying the rent early.
paying the rent early because they are so concerned to be just ideal tenants. Like they don't want to rock the boat. They don't even want to ask for repairs, nothing, because they just want to be perfect tenants and just keep paying the rent. They decide to buy a car finally. Maurice works for Enterprise Rental Car, and so he's fixing cars. They don't even own a car. And in Atlanta, you have to have a car, like especially out in the suburbs where they end up living. And they finally buy a car. And just after they buy a car, their landlord informs them, you know what, I'm gonna sell this condo. Nothing against you, but you have to be out in 60 days. And that is the catalyzing event that ultimately pushes them into homelessness. And they end up in a one-bedroom unit at Extended Stay America. And I spent countless hours with them in this hotel room, them and their three kids. Natalia worked at State Farm as a in their call center, customer service call center. So she's doing her calls for State Farm in this hotel room while her kids are having to be silent, including a toddler. They're having to be silent in the background. And this is how they're spending their pandemic in this hotel room. And this world of extended stay hotel rooms to me was absolutely mind blowing because all around the country you can drive down streets, and they're usually kind of on the periphery of the city, but you drive down streets and you see all these sort of budget or economy motels and hotels, and you just think they're economy hotels and motels. What I realized is these are actually extremely profitable homeless shelters. Where Maurice and Natalia ended up, there were families who were living there not for weeks or months, but for years. Families have the hotel address on their driver's license. The parents have it on their driver's license. There are school buses that pull up every morning to pick up the dozens of children living in these hotels. And, because when you don't have homeless shelters and, family shelters in many cities, or in the case of one family in the book, there's a 15-year-old boy, the son in the family, and he's not allowed to go to a family shelter. He has to go to a men's shelter by himself if they want to go. So in the absence of a shelter system, these hotels have sprung up as kind of shelter of last resort, but they're extremely predatory places. The conditions really are abysmal. And, one of the most shocking things in this reporting was just how incredibly lucrative this insecurity has become for some very powerful institutions and actors in this country. So for instance, just really quick, the same private equity firms that are buying up vast swaths of America's rental housing. And Atlanta, in the words of one scholar, Dan Immergluck, is a private equity strike zone. It's kind of ground zero for Wall Street's incursion into the rental housing market. The same Wall Street firms and investors that are buying up rental housing and employing these techniques that Maurice and Natalia actually fall prey to themselves in another apartment they end up in, of these automated eviction systems that are run by algorithms. And if you're just a day late, an eviction is automatically filed. There's no human to interact with. And that eviction filing will tank your credit score and make it impossible to get into an apartment. So the same people who are making a killing in creating the precarity that's pushing people into this homelessness, they're also cornering the market on the very places where people are forced to go once they lose their housing. And during the pandemic, Extended Stay America, where Maurice and Natalia live, they were at like 80 to 90% occupancy during the pandemic, while all other hotels in the country, the normal hotels, were at 0% occupancy, right? Because of the pandemic. And so Blackstone and Starwood Capital, these private equity giants, they see that and they bought Extended Stay America for $6 billion, right? And as they're purchasing Extended Stay America for $6 billion, because they see an opportunity here, Maurice and Natalia, they spent $17,000 over 8 months, right? 8 months, $17,000. And if they had had an apartment next door, maybe a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment next door, it wouldn't have cost that much. So, I mean, it's an incredibly lucrative, homelessness has become big business in America. And, we're accustomed to the James Baldwin line by now, about how very expensive it is to be poor in the United States. And my book shows another side of that, which is how very profitable it is to have so many people insecure in this country.
The level of exploitation um, is it was so striking to read, companies that co-sign leases for the companies that co-sign leases, the companies that of course do own do the renting out. The prices are so much higher than what anyone could afford, or would
Totally.
be expected would be expected to afford. Your book is not, however, hard to read. And I think this is because, I mean, this is an awful sort of situation, people in a calamitous situation, but the book is not hard to read, in part because you're so careful to give us so much of the people's personalities. We get to know them so well. You paint beautiful portraits of the people of the five families that you follow, and the people that they encounter along the way. And the beauty, it's not a ham-fisted beauty, it's not a forced beauty, it's a beauty drawn from their lives, their personal experiences, because people are beautiful people. Sometimes that means and people are full and complex, and so sometimes that means people are wonderful, like Mrs. Pink, Miss Pink, right? So who I'd love for you to
Uh,
talk about, who we
yes.
meet. And sometimes people collaborate in their own demise. I'm thinking about, in this case, Michelle, and her son, and her son's experience, and DJ's experience, who eventually goes with Miss Pink, at least for a little while. So if you could
Yeah.
talk about these two characters, this family.
Yeah. I mean, just to speak quickly to like which I so appreciate, the beauty of that I hope comes through um the the very human. So, it can be dehumanizing not just to pathologize people, but also dehumanizing to not like show any of their flaws and to just make sometimes in the service of trying to like make a point in a piece of writing, especially as academics, or if you have an argument to make, sometimes the people you're writing about can just become kind of human arguments. They're not actual human beings. They're just kind of one-dimensional cases in point. And it was really important to me to begin each of their stories in a time, like before they're in crisis, like to show them just like with Michelle, her, when we meet her in the book, she's making Christmas Eve dinner and listening to Michael Jackson and wearing her Santa hat. And DJ, her teenage son, comes in the kitchen. He's shy, and she kind of coaxes him into dancing with her. And the chapter, there's nothing really dramatic happening in the chapter. It ends with her and her fiance and her children building a gingerbread house and her toddler falling asleep on the couch. And, it felt important to like not only as a way of showing people in their full humanity, which so much reporting and I think research on poverty tends to exclude, like by just focusing on people in extremis, like we lose something really crucial about who they are, just in a very fundamental sense. But it's also important because I think my hope is that as readers, as people read these stories, they will more fully they will feel in a more, I don't know, just visceral way the loss of that stability once you've glimpsed it, once you've glimpsed the possibility prior to that something really fundamental will seem like it has been stripped away. And so yeah, Pink, who you mentioned, Miss Pink. I mean, when she arrives in the book, it's just like, this is certainly how I felt in real life encountering her. Just like the clouds opened up for a moment and the sun came through, and it's like, okay, there is someone who is willing to show up for these, for
Can you
these.
talk about who she is and how she showed up?
Yeah, so she just defies every kind of category or any attempt to like box her in. She's like a de facto social worker, community activist. She runs like a food pantry out of her car. She has a community boutique where she just collects clothing, not like castaway clothing, but like really nice clothing to distribute to people. She has this whole philosophy that like, and she was unhoused herself for a period. And in during that experience, she saw that like when people who were homeless were like receiving free clothes, it was like the nasty clothes. It was the clothes no one wanted. And she had this idea that like when people put on those clothes, they're putting on an identity. They're being told like you're nasty. Like you don't deserve to look good. You don't deserve to feel handsome or beautiful. And she was like, no, I want people to feel beautiful. So she gives away clothes, she gives away food. But above all, she shows up. Like she shows up when nobody else will. She cultivates what I think I refer to in the book as a kind of radical availability. Even the most committed caseworkers and therapists and church volunteers, they go to bed at 9 o'clock, they turn off their phones. Pink doesn't turn off her phone. She will show up at 1 in the morning to bail you out of jail. She will show up at 1 in the morning to give you a hug, to cry with you, to bring you tampons or diapers or whatever you need. And so so when we encounter her in the book, um, she is someone who is kind of taking on the responsibility um, that has been put on people like her because of the kind of engineered abandonment that so many poor and working class people experience in this country, you know, vis-a-vis the systems that are supposed to watch out for them. And of course, that's getting even more shredded, decimated at this moment. But Pink is sort of the living embodiment of an attempt to just do something despite it all. And she is, I think, just an incredibly inspiring human being. Yeah.
Yeah, and Michelle, who, you know, we meet, as you said, early on in this moment of, you know, love and care with her family. um, you know, her life turns
Yeah.
in many moments, you know, disappointment after disappointment. And then we see her, you know, taking to drinking, taking a new partner, and her and DJ, who's a wonderfully introspective boy. They have this very tense relationship.
Yeah.
We're just scratching the surface of some of the insightful contributions that you've made in this powerful, beautifully written, and in many ways surprising. It's, you know, to those of us who have been following these populations, it's not super surprising, but really counter, I guess counterintuitive to the narrative around and about who is homeless, how homelessness works. And we see these cycles of exploitation. We see changes in the political economy. We see these histories of place and the biographies of people and how those intersect. And it's beautifully done. You hop scale and you weave these stories in just really quite wonderfully. I'm wondering if before we go
Yeah.
before we take questions from the audience, I'm wondering if there's some thoughts that you might want to leave us with, and then we'll go to the audience about your experiences, about what you found, about just anything that you'd like to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just that jumping off what you were just speaking about, like there are a lot of arguments in this book. There's a lot of context. There's a lot of history. There's a lot of policy. Um, but but I was trying to be very, very careful and it's not easy to do this because there is a temptation to sort of like lead in this very heavy-handed way with the big picture and but my hope is that you know what you were alluding to with DJ and his mother and this relationship. We were talking about Maurice and Natalia. You know, they drink wine when the book opens near outside of their apartment, and they're just kind of like, wow, this is our life. Like, my hope is that people will encounter these lives, encounter these experiences with these families, will just be so pulled in to the very human element um, you know, of this narrative, and will feel in a very intimate way, a very like what it is like when parents and their kids are just deprived of this basic necessity. And when they're constantly wondering, where am I going to be tonight? Where, you know, like, where am I going to be when I get off school today? Um, uh, what's going to happen to us tomorrow? That all of the points that come out of that, all the argument that people will feel it in that way. And I guess that's just there's something that can't really be articulated about what they go. You just have to kind of go on that journey with them, and that's what I'm hoping people will do.
No, I think you absolutely accomplished that in this book. It is quite an achievement. It is a beautiful, aching book. But let's turn to audience questions. And you have a lot, which is wonderful. So this is the first question. Can you a little bit about what the city of Atlanta is doing local level to address this?
Yeah, you know, like many cities in America, there is a lot of talk you know, from the mayor to the city council, about addressing the housing crisis, the crisis of affordability. A lot of that has come not because policymakers, whether in Atlanta or elsewhere, just woke up one morning and decided, hey, we want to make sure that that people in the city have a place to live. It's because the emergency, the catastrophe has grown so acute that city leaders can't ignore it any longer. Um, and so there has been a lot of talk. The previous mayor of Atlanta, Keisha Lance Bottoms, she had a very ambitious housing program, really ambitious goals, and very few of those were met. And, the current administration in Atlanta also has some very ambitious goals. He established a housing task force, a strike force, I think it's called. And, there is some progress being made, but I think what I'm hoping this book accomplishes, even for those in Atlanta, who might read it, is just to ask the question of like, what kind of city are we making for ourselves here? Because basically, like, a lot of the solutions are just trying to like beg and convince private developers, private landlords, like, please devote, 15 units in your new complex to those earning below 80% AMI, and it's like, uh, it's just it's like begging for scraps. And what really needs to happen is just a basic rethinking of what kind of city are we making for ourselves, and really beginning to challenge the kind of an urban policy that prioritizes real estate capital above all else, because at the bottom, I mean, all the gentrification that's happening, it's not about individual gentrifiers. It's not just about, does this cafe open? Does this yoga studio open? Does this, white family choose to move into this predominantly Black neighborhood? Before a neighborhood becomes gentrified, it has to become gentrifiable. And that takes us to the question of planning. It takes us to the question of who's making money off of the strategic disinvestment and reinvestment in particular areas of the city. And that, I think, is something that, for all of the well-intentioned statements and even kind of activities that the current administration is engaged in, that question has really been left off the table.
Another question comes in asking if you could give this book to one person, a policymaker, who would it be and why?
Hmm. Yeah. So it's funny. I recently someone asked me a similar question. It was just like, if you could have one person in the world read this book, who would it be, living or dead? I mean, why would I want a dead person to read this book? But and my instinct was to say something like, if not Donald Trump, then at least someone in his staff who might read a book and would be in some position of power, or the mayor and I just want to shift that slightly from like, which policymaker would I want to read this book to saying as clearly and definitively as I can that if this catastrophe is going to be meaningfully addressed, it's not going to be because some policymaker is convinced that like they need to propose this ambitious vision. I appreciate the ambitious visions. I appreciate the uh, I appreciate the visions for 8 million units of social housing that people like Bernie Sanders or AOC have proposed. But if any of this is going to change, it's going to come from the bottom. So I guess my way of answering that question is I would rather just people like who just ordinary citizens read this book and get so enraged at what people are so unnecessarily having to live with in this country, in the richest country on the planet, that they just demand that policymakers take them seriously. Because like the eviction moratorium during the pandemic, that didn't come about you know, because someone in the White House or someone in Congress was like, we need to take care of the millions of tenants who are at risk of being pushed out of their homes. It was because tenants themselves, through tenant organizing, through a tenant rights movement, and the allies of that movement, and those who care enough about their neighbors to say, no, this is intolerable, we're not going to stand for this, demanded that those in Washington and those in their state government and city governments take their plight seriously. So that's my kind of evasive way of saying, of answering the question of which policymaker would I want to read this book.
This isn't an audience question, but it's a question that occurred to me as you were talking. It also seems to me that, I mean, all of what you report in the book, none of it's covered in public policy in any meaningful way. It's a group that we're paying zero attention to. It seems like it's a group that we don't see. I mean, so for example, the eviction moratorium doesn't necessarily like there's a legal question about whether or not that applies to folks in extended stay situations. I don't know if it applies to people in rooming houses or not. So I don't know what are your thoughts about?
Well, I mean, the short answer is that the people I write about in this book, the people I follow, there are millions of others like them, and they have all been written out of the story
Yeah.
we tell about homelessness. And many of them don't even they don't even have the minimal rights given to tenants. So they're in this like gray zone where they don't have any tenant rights and they're locked out of homeless services. They're not considered homeless by HUD, even though they're considered homeless by the Department of Education. That's kind of it's a technical point, but it's super important because there's this entire world of homelessness that, to go back to what we were saying, has been rendered invisible, and that invisibility has very real consequences in their lives. And we're just not paying attention to them. They have been abandoned, and I really am careful to call this, following Ruth Wilson Gilmore, an organized abandonment, right? This has been a bipartisan project of abandoning an entire population of Americans, many of whom have been forced into the low-wage labor market as a result of welfare reform, and they are now trapped in 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 a horrific kind of state of abandonment. And if this book accomplishes anything, it's to just like, what are we doing? How are we ignoring all of these people?
Yes, yes. There are many more policy questions. I'll ask one more policy question and then a final question after that. So the next policy question are your thoughts thinking about this organized abandonment, thinking about the invisibility, thinking about the making of the group invisible, the writing out of through law and policy. The question is asking what it might take to build enough political will for the government at all levels to intervene in the kinds of conditions that push people into, and I'm adding some things to that question, but into this kind of homelessness, which I think we started off saying is perhaps the largest, or at the very least, it is a massive part of this question.
Yeah, so like the end of the book and the epilogue, I really try to lay out a whole sort of menu of steps that can be taken to immediately ease the suffering of these families. And again, the millions like them. And those, solutions fall into two broad categories. One is keeping people in the homes they already have. In other words, preventing homelessness before it starts, which is shockingly left out of a lot of discussions about tackling homelessness in America, just how to stop people from becoming homeless, how to stop that relentless churn that in many cities like LA or San Francisco, for every one person who is able to get out of homelessness into housing, another 4 people become unhoused. So how do you stop that relentless churn? You have to talk about things like eviction defense. You have to talk about strengthening tenant rights. You have to talk about just cause eviction laws and rent stabilization or rent control. There's all sorts of things that can keep people in their homes. And then we need to get people into homes who don't already have them. And for that, that's where we have to talk about social housing. We have to talk about public housing done right, public housing that was not set up to fail, public housing that did not have racism baked into it from the beginning and that saw rampant disinvestment once it became majority Black in public housing. So social housing is the ultimate solution, but I really want to be clear that before any of these, I mean, of course, we can implement these immediately and ease the suffering, but if we're really going to tackle this crisis at scale, like once we've widened the lens on these families and we see, no, homelessness is actually, as bad as the official numbers are, it's much, much, much worse. If we're going to address this catastrophe at scale, the only way we're going to get there and build to that question, the political will, is by being so shocked that we've allowed this to happen. As an anthropologist, like one of the most basic sort of anthropological moves is to take things that are familiar and make them strange to us, right? To make the familiar strange. And something that is familiar that we just take for granted as part of our status quo is that housing is a vehicle for wealth accumulation, that housing is a kind of commodity, and that the few who own it, the few who are lucky enough to own property will invariably profit at the expense of the many, 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 many more in this country who just need a place to live. We just take that for granted. But what if we began to see housing the way we do like education, that every kid K through 12 in this country, we don't look to private schools to make sure that kids are educated. We said we're going to make sure that every kid has access to a K through 12 education? What if we started to treat housing as this essential public good and treat it as just a basic right? And so I feel like until we have that kind of paradigm shift about what housing is and who it's for and what its purpose is, and we're like this vision of achieving social housing and implementing like stronger tenant protection, all these things will be built on shaky ground. We have to have a rethinking of housing in this country if we are truly going to end homelessness and housing insecurity.
I think this is a perfect place to end this conversation. What a wonderful book. Again, folks, everybody needs to get this. There is no place for us working and homeless in America. Brian Goldstone, you've done something remarkable. So I feel like you left us with a lot. But is there a final thought before we say goodbye?
Well, I'm very grateful I'm grateful there were so many questions that like forced me to think about things in new ways. And I guess the final thought is just like, as you know, I'm sitting here in DC, very close to the White House right now. I'm in the New America offices, and there's a feeling as I'm talking about treating housing as a basic human right, a realization I hope people will just intuitively come to in reading these family stories and traveling on these journeys with them. There's something that can feel kind of hopelessly utopian or out of touch about talking about housing as a human right, talking about building social housing, public housing done right at a time when this already threadbare safety net is just being absolutely shredded. And I just want to, I guess, leave us with the thought that our vision of a just society, our vision of what's right, our vision of the kind of country, the kind of cities, the kind of societies we want to have should not be determined by what this or that administration that happens to be in power happens to be proclaiming or doing at a particular moment. We need to stay focused on what we want our country to look like, while also, of course, dealing with the immediate violence that's being done. But I guess I just want, maybe I'm saying that as much for myself as for those who are tuning in right now.
No, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much for this wonderful book. Again, There Is No Place for Us Working and Homeless in America by Brian Goldstone. It's a remarkable achievement. Everyone should have a copy. We'll get it out to the policymakers. We must do that too. That's part of our job. Let's do it. And thank you all for joining us.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for your work, Ruben. And thank you for this incredible conversation.
So happy to join.
Okay. Bye, everyone.